Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeffrey Kenny. I'm Associate Curator with Mason Exhibitions. I'm pleased that you all can make it to today's presentation. Before we begin, I would like to start today, as we do all our lectures, by acknowledging the Monacan Nation, including the Monahoke people, who are the traditional owners of the land and waters upon which George Mason University stands. In addition, on behalf of the Mason art community, I affirm our commitment to anti-racism, social justice, and creating a culture of excellence, inclusion, and accessibility. Today, we'll have a Q&A session following the presentation, so we ask that you save your questions until the end. If you would like to ask a question at that point, please do so by using the raise hand feature on your Zoom. Once called upon, you may then ask your question directly to our artists. Today's presentation will be recorded and we'll make it available on our Graphic Liberation webpage on the Mason Exhibitions website. Today's presentation is structured as a conversation between two socially engaged and politically oriented designers, Josh MacPhee and Sandy Kaltenborn. This conversation coincides with the Graphic Liberation exhibition and workshop currently on view in the Gillespie Gallery of Art at GMU's Art and Design Building. In addition to organizing the Graphic Liberation exhibition, Josh MacPhee is an internationally renowned designer, design historian, and founder of Just Seeds Artist Cooperative. So, excuse me, folks. I have a toddler melting down in my lap here. Okay. MacPhee is also the founder of Interference Archive and Signal, a journal of international and political graphics culture. MacPhee founded Just Seeds as a way to develop and distribute t-shirts, posters, and stickers with revolutionary content. Since 1999, Just Seeds has organized the Celebrate People's History poster project, which is a selection of which is on view in the exhibit in our gallery. The project is an ongoing poster series in which different artists are invited to create posters which memorialize moments and figures in revolutionary history. MacPhee has also published numerous books about the production of political graphics, including Celebrate People's History, the poster book of resistance and revolution, Realizing the Impossible, Art Against Authority, and Reproduce and Revolt, among many other titles. Today, Josh will be in conversation with designer Sandy Kaltenborn. Kaltenborn is the founder of Image Shift, a graphic design studio based in Berlin, Germany. The studio is dedicated to cultural, social, and political graphic and communication design. Kaltenborn founded the studio in 1999. The studio includes Kaltenborn and colleagues Athena Yavanna Marty and Paco Camberlin. They base their work on companionship rather than the conventional client-designer relationship as determined by the ideologies of the service industries. They approach projects collaboratively and calibrate their production to specific questions around social, cultural, and political relations. Aware of the specific responsibility of visual producers as those who have power to shape a certain discourse, Image Shift are working for society and not for the market. Josh and Sandy, thank you for your time. And I apologize for the, the toddler interruptions there.
All good. I'm more than familiar. Thanks everyone for checking in. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Sandy today. It's 2 p.m. here, but it's 8 p.m. in Berlin, so it's the end of probably a long day for Sandy. But before we jump right into it, I wanted to just say that this is the 7th in a series of conversations under the sort of title or rubric of graphic liberation. The previous 6 you can find at justseeds.org if you just search for graphic liberation. And then I have 2 more, actually 3 more planned for this spring. 2 have dates set for them. One is going to be on March 9th, and it's with Judy Seidman, who is part of the Medu Arts Ensemble, which was one of the main cultural groupings that was part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. That's again on March 9th. And then on April 24th, I'll be talking with 3 or 4 members of A3BC, which is a political block printing collective out of Tokyo. And there'll be more information about those. Again, if you go to justseeds.org and just search for graphic liberation, there's a project page and has all the information, and it will eventually also have the recording from this conversation as well. So the way that these talks and conversations have happened is I ask each of the people that I'm talking with to give me a handful of images, and then I throw them up on the screen, and we start the conversation by talking briefly about a minute or so about each image to give everyone in the audience sort of a visual grounding in the practice and what the person is doing in terms of design and graphic production and the relationships to politics and social movements. And then we'll dive right into a sort of more free-form conversation, because the hope of this is to not have a kind of canned talk, but to actually be able to sort of just follow where the conversation goes and get at some interesting points that maybe don't get explored as deeply when we're sort of worried about presenting on a certain number of things or making sure that we have some sort of finite argument we're trying to make. So to that end, I'm going to share my screen and we'll just jump right in. And thanks so much to George Mason for hosting this, and for hosting the Graphic Liberation exhibition, and then also to Sandy for being willing to be here and talk with me. So welcome.
Hello, Josh. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the whole team for supporting this. And I would like to apologize a little bit for my English. I'm not a native English-speaking person, so we'll have to work with this. And Josh, you probably have to translate a little bit when I don't find words. Well, thank you for having me tonight. And this sounds like a great series. I already looked at some of the former talks, and I find them very interesting, and I find the format itself super interesting, and I'm ready.
Okay, can you see the image up on the screen?
Yeah.
Sandy? Okay, so tell me about it.
Well, first of all, it was very, very hard challenge actually to only send you 4 images, and you can see already on the first slide that I tricked you or tried to trick you a little bit. This is an image of a book cover. Actually, the poster looks very similar, and it's called Engagement in Graphic Design. And this is kind of where I come from, what was important for me within my graphic design education and in my activism. And this was an exhibition I hosted with some friends, which I curated here in Berlin at the New Society of Fine Art, which is a very democratic, basic democratic gallery, kind of collectively run. And it's exploring the French graphic tradition, mainly which came out of the '68 student revolt in Paris. And I was very much influenced by this movement, or by this group Grapus, which is in the center of this. This exhibition actually showed a lot of works of collective which emerged from this group Grapus. And maybe we can talk about this more in detail later, but maybe just to talk about this image of the book cover. And some of you probably have recognized this hand in the background is a cutout from the very famous German anti-fascist designer or artist, John Hartfield. And it's actually an election poster. And I think the original text, which I overlaid with this blue box at the bottom, said, 5 fingers has your hand. With 5 fingers with the hand, you grab the enemy. Vote for list number 5. I think it says communist, something like this. I didn't look it up again. Anyway, and the second reference is
roughly what it says.
Thank you. And the second reference is actually the broom, which is covering this cutout eye in the center of the hand. And I was very much into fly postering. And in the 90s, when I moved to Berlin, 1990, fly postering, and still is a big thing in Berlin. So I was very much into the streets and putting up posters and signs and symbols and graffiti, but mainly fly postering. But the broom was at the same time cleaning the eye or brushing the eye. And this is actually another reference to a Polish-French designer, which was called Roman Cislewicz. And he is actually also very much influenced this French tradition. And there was a quote of him, which we placed in the beginning of this book. And the quote kind of goes like this: in times where we are flooded with images which smear, which close the eyes. So it's a flood of images which make our eyes dirty so we can't see anymore. So in these times, it's the responsibility of artists and designers to make images which clean the eye. That's about it for the first image. This is a poster series I also designed in the 90s. Actually, one of the first posters which I designed on a computer. I had a very hard time in cutting out these portraits. And this photo, so the poster series is about people without legal papers, sans-papiers, so-called illegals. And it reads over the 4 posters, "No one is illegal," which was a big campaign in the 90s, started at a big art show, the Documenta, in the 90s. And I designed this poster series, and the poster series, how you can see it here, is part of a workshop with refugee children in the harbor of Hamburg. And you have to understand that in the 90s, we didn't have a situation like we have today, where we have a lot of immigration and where diversity becomes slightly part of mainstream. It was a very, very white dominant mainstream at this time. And so placing these unnormal, in, how do you say, exclamation marks, or no, these little things, on a poster was kind of not radical, but interesting at least. And what's a bit difficult to read is to see that underneath these main letters of kein Mensch ist illegal, there's some small text. And the small text, actually, these 4 posters relate to different situations which people without papers are confronted in daily life. So for instance, one would read, "I wanted to go to school, but my family all didn't have papers. So I was just hanging around at home and felt very lonely where the other children went to school." The other posters read, for instance, "I was very sick, but I couldn't go to the hospital. I felt that I would be dying, but I had no chance because I don't have any papers." The third one talked about public space and racial profiling. So people were, I think the text read something like, "They asked me for papers, but they didn't wait for my answer. They pushed me to the ground and examined me." And the fourth one I forgot now. So this poster series, or there's something which I find, or always did find interesting, is what I could call communication strategy. So basically what you see is friendly portraits of 4 people, and they're smiling at you. And then you start reading the text, and the text is actually very disturbing because it's describing a violent situation. So there's this, I don't know if you could say interference or irritation between the smiling portraits, images, and the text, which also triggers images. As I just told you, the text, you all have images in your head. And so this was the concept of this poster series, and it was widely distributed throughout Germany. It was a very big print, actually. And yeah, but actually I picked this poster because mainly because of the communication strategy, which I find worth talking about. And I mentioned earlier, I was always very interested in fly postering. And if you do fly postering, from my understanding, the design doesn't really end at the edge of the poster. The design doesn't end at the computer or whatever silkscreen of the artist or designer. but the people who put up the posters in public space, they're kind of like continuing the shaping the communication aspects, the content. And so they're also designing public space. And so this poster series is actually quite boring in terms of design. It's a poster series which kind of, which we made, I think, also in the late 90s, I think, or maybe it was during the financial crisis. And the financial crisis was hitting the planet, and this activist group, was a very big activist group, they kind of had the urge to bring the crisis into the streets and to kind of like, well, tell the public about that there's a problem going on, where Germany didn't feel like there was a big problem at the time. So the poster reads crisis, so Krise, but it was an exclamation mark. And I think each letter has a specific meaning. I think the first one says capitalism. The second one says Rettungspaket, which is rescue packages for banks. So they saved the banks, but they didn't save the people. The third reads international. The fourth, solidarity. And the E is for emancipation. And the question mark says how to continue. So this was a city Scrabble game. So the idea was to actually expand this idea of people who are doing fly postering, that they're actually designing the city. So we wanted to see how creative they can be with these 5 letters and an exclamation mark. So this is just a small sample of what they wrote: kiss or cookie or cakes or ice cream. These are all little words. And actually what was very interesting, that they started on their own, even though we didn't facilitate this, they started their own little blog or a communication about, they started a little challenge or battle, who made the most weird and funny Scrabble words with these 6 posters. Yeah, that's about it. Whoa, okay. These are 4 images from my engagement in the last 10 years. I started a tenant initiative with my neighbors 10 years ago, which is called Cotti & Co. Cotti is a shortcut. It's the nickname of the big intersection where I live, where I'm at right now, right here. And it's called Cottbuser Tor, and it's in Berlin-Kreuzberg, a very diverse, countercultural, progressive, green-governed neighborhood, strongly hit by gentrification in the last 10 years. And I picked these 4 images because they are on some extent about design, but much more on the question, how can different formats of design, but when I say design, I don't mean necessarily organizing shape in a certain media. I mean shaping in a wider sense, also shaping politics. So this initiative is fairly successful, has been or still is. And the way we manage this is that we kind of build what I would call multi-layer protest, but it's not about protest, it's way beyond protest. So these 4 images, the first one on the left top shows a demonstration. The one below, which is an infographic, not the best I made in my life, but it explains, so this started actually in social housing. I wouldn't like to dig too deep into social housing, but social housing in Berlin and Germany is something very different than in the US. It's not sustainable, it's not forever, and it's to a big chunk in private hands. And so the whole financing system, how it works, it's pretty a mess. It basically means that we, the taxpayers and the state, pay a lot, you know, and at the end of this whole process of erecting and the rents and, you know, maintaining the buildings, after 30, 40 years, all the money is gone to the private investors and the rents are exploding. And that's exactly what's happened to us. And here we organized a conference. You can see the picture on the bottom right. And this infographic was part of this conference in a publication, and explained the government how a sustainable funding of social housing within revolving fund. It's not something we invented, but we traveled to Austria, to Salzburg and other places where they're erecting very cheap, very good quality social housing without any credits of the bank. So we tried to bring this into the public discourse and to the politicians into parliament. And the picture of the conference, was, in the very beginning, we started with the small demonstrations, and then we squatted something. And you can see this on the top right picture. You can see on the left-hand side, something like a wooden building. We erected actually a building here in the street, which is still standing now for 10 years. And one of our first demands was a conference on social housing, because we understood that the problem is much more complex that you just change the law. And the title of the conference is a provocation, and it's also about design. And we called the conference Nichts läuft hier richtig, which kind of translates to everything is wrong. And the building above is actually the building I'm sitting in. It's located here at Cottbusser Tor. And the people sitting at the end is the state secretary, then a sociologist, next to him, a homeless person who showed up at our protest camp, and we just brought him along all the way because he's a great guy. His name is Tunjai. Next to this is my girlfriend, and the one who's moving his chair is me. On the far right, you can see people from the administration, which were kind of forced by politicians to attend to this conference. And at the very front of this photo, you see 3 women, and there were many more women. These are all working class women. They're all my neighbors. And so we all brought them into parliament. And so this was not only about expertise and discussion, this was also about confrontation. So the people who are in charge for this, let's say, fucked up system are sitting on the other side of the table, who are actually being threatened by rising rents and have a hard life because of these not working programs. So, and the top right photo is, we have an association beside our activist group. It's called Kotti Co-op Association, and we do community work. And this is a demonstration I organized with children of the primary school, and this was the end of the demonstration. We came to our little protest hut, and for instance, we also do the picture on the background of me. If you can see it, all these eyes, these are portraits, and so we do exhibitions in public space, and we try to do a lot. Let's leave it like this. Yeah, thanks. It's more than a minute. Sorry, George. You feel free to interrupt me if I'm talking too long.
No, this is great. And you basically gave us the whirlwind tour of your last 30 years of work. And I think in that is embedded your thinking about design and what it can do and what it should do and what it does well and maybe what it doesn't do as well. And maybe as a sort of launching off point from this, maybe you could talk about this transition from being focused on designing within the 4 corners of a page to designing with a realization that the ideas have to come off that page, and that page has to it has a place in the world, to basically in a way abandoning the page and thinking about what it means to design. And maybe design is even not the best word, but to sort of take these ideas you've learned through the practice of design and enact them in different fields in the world. I mean, I remember the last time we had a really long chat, other than a couple of weeks ago, you were telling me that you were at the verge of dissolving the studio because you were so deeply embedded in the work with Coty and Co. And that's, you didn't do that, but can you talk a little bit about this sort of process and moving from page to off the page to sort of like, well, screw the page, maybe there's more important things to focus on?
Yes. Ooh, where to start? Well, let's start here. Well, every design is social. Every image, every product does shape us every day. A mug does, and a poster does, and an image does. And what we just saw with Jeffrey and his kid also does. And if we talk about the social and political aspects of design, we actually couldn't have had a better introduction as Jeff and his kid just gave us. So it's not about his introduction, it's about much more. And so when I say every image is social, and when we take this serious, then we have to understand that social is something which is between at least two people. It's something like a dialogue and less than a monologue. So I was always interested in, I mean, there's a lot of, well, I wanted to say political posters, but that's also already a problem when we talk about political poster, saying, you know, every poster is actually political, advertising is political. So it's a weird distinction, but let's try to work with these political posters. And we have images now ahead, and these images are probably fists and struggle and fights and stuff. Most of the times they're illustrating a struggle, they're complaining, they're criticizing certain circumstances. So they're kind of like a writing trying to put into an image, but not really challenging what lies behind the eye. So what I find interesting is what happens actually after the audience, the recipient read or saw the image. That's actually much more interesting than me as a great artist putting out my message. Hey folks, that's what I want to tell you, and I'm on the right side in this struggle, maybe. Well, you made a big jump. So that's why when I started doing design in the context of social movements or posters, and I showed this in the introduction, I was always interested what the media actually can do more than just carrying this information. You know, so when I design a book, for instance, it's not about, it is a lot about the layout, and the typography and the pages, but it's also about the paper and what happens when you open the book and how expensive is the book. All these things are actually very interesting for designers who care about larger questions, I feel. So I'm making a big jump now. Well, and to say it very simply, actually, because you were talking about, I was thinking about dissolving the studio. I felt for a period of time that the studio was dissolving because other things were more important. And what I'd like to say is when you raise the social question, do you say this in English, the social question? Die soziale Frage, do you say that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people say it enough, but yes. Or I mean, right now we're struggling with the antisocial question. So,
well, let's say it differently. When you're talking about political struggle and fights and battles,
we talk about social movements, yeah.
Okay, well, but we have this term soziale Frage, social questions. And I have the feeling to a certain extent, a lot of, at least in the social movements, activists, they ask these questions and they raise these questions, but are not entering the field to a certain extent. They stay in their subcultural, countercultural movement, self-fulfilling, very identified contexts and scenes. And actually, what's interesting to me, where does social change really happen? It happens when some people change their opinion, right? So, and changing their opinion means you have to confront yourself with other people and other realities. And that's what culture is about. I mean, culture in general is a form of solidarity where society negotiates certain matters. So what I like to say, if you want to answer certain questions or engage in certain questions, you have to enter the fields. You have to irritate yourself. You have to be curious and open actually to change. And when you enter these struggles, you will see very quickly that your understanding of design is questioned on a very productive level. I'll give you a simple example. When I started with my neighbors this tenant initiative here, I wanted to design the first flyer. First of all is what kind of aesthetics do I use? That because the neighborhood is super diverse. We have a lot of Turkish immigrants here. We have a lot of very conservative people. We have working class people. We have counterculture people, leftist activists. Very, for Berlin, quite diverse, one of the diversest places in Berlin. So what aesthetics? Yeah, and I made the first design, and the answer was, don't use color, because if it's in the letterboxes, then people think it's advertising. So I made a great design, which was right in the face, but my neighbors explained to me, no, if it's like this on an A4 leaflet, people would put it in the bin right away because they don't have this translation that they read this as something which addresses them on a different level than advertising. So, so what happened, I mean, I'm very grateful and thankful for the work I did for decades, because I never was forced to do any stuff I wouldn't like, and I never did anything I didn't see in a sense of. And I can make my living. I don't get rich, but I'm happy. So it's a great privilege. But even though I was involved in quite some movements and actions, most of the work, design work, was discourse work. It was about telling the world or communicating content. And what happened with this tenant initiative, to me, it really questioned my work on another level. And on the level, actually, no, this was not about saying the rent is too high. It was more about lowering the rent. And the buildings which are surrounded here, you can't see them now. So they were all privatized under a senator in Berlin in the early 2000s. And this is a very poor neighborhood. And it was, now these buildings used to be owned until recently by a real estate company, a stock company called Deutsche Wohnen, which is quite ugly. And it was Cerberus, you probably know Cerberus. They also owned our homes for a while, and they sold it. And so this was not about discourse. This was really about, we're not starting to protest. We're really starting this to win, to simply win. And we started with this. You probably know what this is. You probably know Milton Glaser's I Love New York. So what's the design work in this? I copied Milton Glaser. Many other cities in the world did so before. I love Amsterdam, I love Nepal, whatever, Neapel, whatever. But here was different. The difference was, this is a neighborhood which was mainly talked about. The neighborhood didn't have any voice because we have very poor people, marginalized people living here, working class people, homeless people, unemployed people with no voice. And this neighborhood has been always talked about as a problematic neighborhood, as a dangerous and problematic neighborhood. So suddenly there was this initiative and said, well, this might be the case. This is a difficult place, but we like our home. And the second thing we designed was a postcard, and it reads, "Greetings from Cottbusser Tor." And you can already see here, this is not, it doesn't say, well, in the banner it says, we love Kotti and we hate rent. But it doesn't say, it doesn't show a fist. It doesn't show, oh, we're suffering, the rent is rising, help us. It says on the small line at the back, stop the rising rents at Cottbusser Tor. Tenant initiative Kotti and Co. We're called Kotti and Co. And the same here. It says stop the rising rents, and there's no fist or something. So And to make a very long story short, I find it interesting to think about the connection of such a simple sticker and a postcard. And 10 years later, 3,500 flats for, actually the city bought the buildings back, which they sold for, I think about 3 billion euros. So we've managed in the last 10 years to shift billions into our poor neighborhoods. It's not only here, some other neighborhoods too. But I believe that there's a connection between visual communication, communication design, and political strategies, or yeah. So, and maybe from there you understand why I felt at sometimes being a designer, to be honest, being a designer always bored me. It's saying I'm a designer is in certain contexts is quite a chic thing to, how do you say, not chic, a nice thing to say, you know. So but I find professions actually very boring. I find it interesting when professions actually are interacting with other fields, and when they get these identities, these self-identities of, oh, I'm a designer, when they get challenged. That's what I find interesting. And the most interesting is actually when we collaborate. You know, it's the most interesting projects is when you collaborate with sociologists, with artists, with working class people, with homeless people. And then it's not about me being designer, it's about what we accomplish together with our very different experience and knowledge, which we bring in together. So, and I also don't like to call my studio a graphic design studio, it's a communication design studio. So I'll leave it for there.
Well, I mean, this jumps into one of the, you talked about this with your first project, that you were very deeply steeped in sort of a history of communication design, and like extremely knowledgeable, and have a deep toolbox, for lack of a better term, of the visual and other mechanisms that are used to convey ideas. And one of the things about a lot of the work you've done is, it, like the sticker you showed, it references this history and this sort of development of how ideas are communicated. How do you navigate that space between sort of design that's self-referential versus design that's attempting to communicate to people that aren't steeped in any way in that history of design? I don't know if this question makes sense. You know, when you're deploying Hartfield, and
It's super difficult to design without distinction, without exclusion. I don't know if this goes in the direction of your question.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it connects into a related sort of question or set of ideas, which is that you with the Coty and Co projects have really you've created a platform that has used an immense amount of design. I mean, everything does, but self-consciously to really push heavily on levers for social transformation, and have been really successful. Part of that is the ability to reach out of this countercultural milieu, or out of the internal dynamics within a specific neighborhood to address issues around, you know, rent and tenants' rights on a citywide or even a national level. There's not a lot of examples in the US of that happening recently. Usually, like, the design that's even if it's very effective in a certain field, it doesn't necessarily transcend the kind of space or the people that are just focused on that zone. But you've kind of broken out to the point where, like, if you live in Berlin, you have to negotiate and deal with the dynamics that you've helped build through your tenants initiative, like what were some of the tools for helping to make that happen?
Making yourself productively dependent. I mean, I'm not this initiative. The initiative was very diverse from the very beginning. As mentioned, we had working class, very religious, conservative people, more Turkish AKP Erdogan fans, radical leftists, atheists, people who wear glasses, people who are small, people who are big, kids, senior citizen. And so then starting the computer or the sketchbook was always in my mind, how would they see it and how would this work? And I had it's a great luxury that I was able to test a few things. I'd like to give you one example. I'm not sure if I'm directing in the right direction, but coming back to this conference where I showed this image in the beginning, I already said we had the politicians, we had the administration, we had the people from the neighborhood, and we had an audience. So how does the brochure with information and the program has to look like, where it has to reach to experts? We have to convince experts. So we have to design infographics, which they can read and understand and take serious. But they shouldn't be so complicated that other people feel excluded by this. So in this brochure, we had images from our neighborhood, for instance. We had a portrait of a woman, it's too complicated to explain, but was on the backside and showing her passport. It's about racism, about segregation and so on. And she was talking about it, and she was standing in front of the city development administration here in Berlin and showing her passport and saying, this was racist, what happened to me here in this neighborhood. So as I said in the very beginning, it's nearly impossible to not exclude by any kind of aesthetics. But my aim was to develop a visual culture or language, which is simple to access, but not superficial at the same time. So some of the designs, for instance, I made a poster which reads, Miete essen Seele auf, rent eats soul. And so everybody understands rent eats soul, you know, so you have a poster behind you, cancel rent, with hearts, which is interesting with the hearts. But, you know, so everybody understands that high rent is kind of like a pain in the ass if you have little money, right? But rent eats soul has a reference to a film by Rainer Werner Fassbinder, which is called Angst essen Seele auf, fear eats soul. So there was another layer in this poster for another audience, which is maybe more into film and academic. And so you had this double reference, or not double reference, but you had these two layers. So it was not superficial, it was very straightforward, but at the same time, it had many layers beneath. And the first response from my neighbors, working class neighbors who don't know the movie, and the movie is interestingly about the relationship between two working class person, one white woman, and POC person, and about the impossibility of love in a racist society, racist Germany, I think in the 70s. And the first reaction of my Turkish neighbors was that, well, you know, this is not very good German. There's some words missing in this on this poster. So, and I don't know if this goes in the direction of your question. I find it very challenging to, and I believe I would say we should take every image very, very serious, but we also shouldn't take them too serious at the same time. And the recipient is always free to read whatever he or she wants to read. You can go tomorrow or maybe later this afternoon, as it's still in the midday at your place right now, walk through the streets and try to counter-read advertising and make jokes about advertising within your mind. Read the images the other way around, and it's funny. It's very entertaining. But communication, so shall I continue?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe part of what you just said connects back to your original image of this sort of cleaning of the eye, which I think it's prophetic, given that most of us now spend upwards of 5 or 6 hours a day on a little teeny screen on our hand, looking at images scroll by endlessly on social media or news or whatever. And it seems pretty clear to me that for the most part, they're gunking our eyes up. They're not, there's at the end of that session, there's far less clarity than there was at the beginning. And so maybe tie that back in and think of it like, has your thinking around this changed? Because the demand for eye cleaning certainly is, over the last 20 years, has exploded, right? It's just so much more intense at this moment than it was. It feels exponentially more intense every day.
Yeah, as it did when Gutenberg invented print, right?
It was more time to adjust.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, and I would go with this. But at the same time, I would reject this. You're not saying that, but there's a tendency of cultural pessimism, that things get worse and people can't read images anymore and can't read books because they're stuck to their iPhones. I have the feeling the field is expanding, and therefore it's very important, or at least important to me, to think about distribution and context of reception. So that's also what I meant. I like to think about how it feels to take a book in the hand, wherever this person is sitting at the moment, but the medium does something to them. And an image like behind me, for instance, or the images of your kid behind you with the magnets in a White Cube exhibition, I can imagine that the reception will be fairly different. So I'm not this pessimistic. I still believe in the social capacities of images, but I'm more interested to ingrained in these not only images, design also, or media, within larger processes and contexts, and to understand them as one part within a wider stream of communication or transformation or change. I mean, for instance, here in Germany, I mean, I made a lot of anti-racist posters in the past, and I was involved in a lot of anti-racist struggles, and probably still am. But I have to admit that on Instagram, that diversity, Germany is not a very diverse country to say, it's still very white. But in the last years, other stories, other aesthetics, other bodies have emerged into new spaces and into mainstream. And when I look through Instagram, I see a lot of aesthetics which carry stories, perspectives, identities, and so they're very important. And they're a flood, and I think they're a great flood. And I'm also swiping through, and I'm just like, way too much, So, but I still believe in visual communication. Let's put it this way. And I think it's very interesting what's happening, and I'm actually more welcoming these new possibilities. But at the same time, I feel a bit old that, oh, why can't we just have one poster and talk about this one poster, and the poster will change the world? And it's not not going to happen. But of course, I mean, there is social movements and battles where it's one image. It's very strong, it's very powerful, which can change the world too. So I think it's happening at the same time. And it's great, it's interesting.
Well, this gets into this question about, you mentioned the word flood, which gets into questions about control and about collaboration. So, like, for instance, with Coty and Co, did you do all the design work, or did, like, if you're sort of dissolving your identity as designer in some way into being organizer, were there organizers who were dissolving their identities into being designers or cultural workers, or like, or was, like, how did you negotiate the slippages between these kinds of labor? Because I know that you feel strongly about certain images being the ones that should get used. So
it's a very challenging question. Let's enter this answer a little bit more, how do you say, authoritarian way. I believe I'm a good designer and I have a lot of experience, and I want the best for my initiative. So I can be very critical about some, the same goes for language. And for text, I've written with some few others, most of the text of Coty and Co. And there's a certain poetry and kindness, and it's a certain language which we developed with some people. But what was actually, so that's difficult. I'm still a professional, you know, so, and I'm always happy to explain and to argue. And we haven't been an initiative where there's kind of like a standard in most of the social movements, leftist activist world in Germany. Everybody should be able to do everything. I don't necessarily believe in this. I don't have the skills of my neighbors. I don't have the social networks, real networks. Well, now I have, but I didn't have 10 years ago as my neighbors. I don't speak Turkish and many other things, you know. So, and I'm not good in Turkish cooking, for instance. Some Afghan food, maybe, not really, actually. It's kind of like all in the mix, not as good as my mother. So it's a challenging question because I'm not totally dissolving away from my profession. But at the edges, I'm doing much more than just designing and operating as a designer. My identity is not being a designer. My identity here is not even being an activist. I don't like the term activist in the first place. Because it kind of like says, oh, so some people are active and some people are not active. And in the context of Right to the City, everybody is fucking active in the city, right? So even the homeless people are activists in this sense, you know. So, so what was beautiful is that some of the designs were taken, and for instance, people would draw their own banners and little cardboard shields on demonstrations, and they would take the I Love Coty and merge it and changed it. And we have a lot of initiatives in Berlin who copied this Glaser idea, which I introduced here for tenant initiatives in Berlin. So it's floating, which is great. But there were also situations where, I mean, there were not so many people, there are not so many people who do design or art. Actually, no one. There was one person who's been with us for a while who was an illustrator. And he was a great illustrator, but image politics wise, I had some issues because His illustrations were very much about the neighborhood gathering, very diverse, and they're raising fists and flags. And that's kind of like an iconography, which we know from the 20s, or I mean, more than 100 years ago. And I find them fairly boring because these kind of images actually only fulfill some kind of reassurance that we are on the right side. It just speaks to the little world, and it's not reaching out. You can, if you see a fist or a slogan, you can say, I like it, I agree, or I don't. End of the story. Or I identify, I like it this much, I'll put it up in my living room or my toilet. Great. End of the story, which is important. We all need cultural products to reproduce our being and our identities. That's for sure. I have also things around me which I don't have these high expectations that I have towards my work, but yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I would maybe defend the lowly fist, and at least argue that it has other uses as well. But I also agree. I understand your point. I do think that the fists and flags and other things that are recognizable, part of their power is their recognition, and that people across language and geography and time can recognize and see each other and sort of build solidarities out of that.
I agree. I agree, Josh. But the questions, I agree. I totally agree. And I've become more tolerant over the years. I believe 20 years ago, you remember our argument around these questions. But still, I'd like to raise the question, if we use these icons of political design from more than 100 years ago, which still function, how do they translate to today? And can we take it a bit further from there?
Well, or I mean, I think I would maybe ask the question from the other angle and say, okay, if we're going to drop these images or these graphics, what can take their place that can not only do the work on a local level to help to organize or build solidarities in a community, but to connect that struggle with the struggle that's happening, somewhere else, and a struggle that's happening somewhere else. Because it's easy to build internal communication strategies that create a sort of in crowd within a small group to feel that they're part of or connected to something. It's harder to build those in ways that are not only open to people who aren't in your geography or speak your language, but also people that aren't already engaged.
I agree. But I would like to add that this image reduces struggle to strength and battle. And I believe that the left is strong when we manage to ingrain or include daily life and difficulties within our visual culture, and not only pathetic images of struggle. This is not a contradiction to what you just pointed out. It's just basically what I believe in, which I find interesting. I made images with a fist, actually. I don't have it with me, with a huge fist and with a huge flag. But I'll give you an example of the red flag. And this was also in the 90s. And in Berlin, we have this traditional radical left 1st of May demonstration, 20,000 or 40,000 in the highest times, maybe radical leftists on the street. It's very strong, and there's always riots at the end. And it's quite an institution. And I was active in a leftist video group called Ackerkrag. And we had a screening on 2nd of May. So I kind of like thought, well, Okay, there's 1st of May. 1st of May is revolution. All right, I'll put this into my calendar. And the 2nd of May, we all go back to work, right? So, so I made this poster with a huge red flag, and it says Revolutionary 2nd of May. And this was, so we were out fly postering, and we saw the other radical leftists also fly postering their real red flags and the fists and so on. And they were starting to tear down our posters because they felt challenged about these. How can you be so disrespectful to a revolutionary struggle tomorrow on 1st of May or in 5 days? And so this polarized a lot and caused a lot of frictions and irritation, but the irritation was productive. A lot of people loved the poster and some people hated the poster. So yeah.
I mean, if these sort of tired if still powerful symbols, if anything, provide a platform for iteration and manipulation and critique, and they seem very fertile for that kind of engagement, for trying to turn them inside out and see what comes of it. We're getting, it's 3:02. Maybe we can talk for another 5 or so minutes and then jump into questions. Does that sound good?
I wanted to show, I forgot to put up this.
Oh. For your background.
Yeah, for my background. Yeah, because the bookshelf is a bit further away. I have a lot of books too, so don't worry.
I don't think anyone was worried about your lack of reading.
Yeah.
So just to end, maybe I've been sort of cleaning up a conversation that we had and recorded over a decade ago, in which you talked about something, and I'm going to attempt to speak German here, so geez, I apologize way ahead. Blindheit am Arbeitsplatz. Workplace blindness. We were talking about this sort of idea of workplace blindness, or you call them inner circle logics. Blindheit am Arbeitsplatz. Now I'm stumping you with your own your own phrase, but I think basically you were talking about how when you go and you sit at the same desk every day and you look at the same screen, or you develop patterns, and how important it is to break out of those patterns.
Yeah.
I clocked that, but didn't think much about it a decade ago. But now, after 2 years of pandemic, it's taken on like an entirely different meaning. In that our lives have become so much more circumscribed in terms of what our physical bodies are doing. And I was wondering if you thought any more about that, or how you're relating to that, particularly in, I know I have an organization that I work with, not, at the depth of which you've been working with Koti, but I work with this organization, Catal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice. And I've been working with them for going on 6 years around questions of incarceration and decarcerating people. And the last 2 years, other than one of the people that I'm really close with, I haven't been able to actually physically meet with any of the people that I work with, and how much that's transformed the work, and how it's made it more challenging in so many different ways. So just as a sort of final parting thought, in terms of, it's one thing to be a designer and sit in front of a screen with the knowledge that the work that you're doing is going out in the world and you'll get to engage with it. It's another thing to sit in front of a screen all day and not have those, or as many of those outputs where you actually get to see the embodiment of the work that you're doing, and you get to sort of engage and maybe the reality there is different than it is here as well, in terms of the sort of relationship to the pandemic.
Um,
but I feel like I have a lot of workplace blindness.
yeah. Um, well, the pandemic and the social isolation or reduction is definitely a challenge, and it's not good for us human beings and for creativity in general. But in my studio, I work with Athena and with Paco. We have kind of like fixed places, but not really. We move around. So we're not like only in this way. We go out. We have exhibitions in the streets. We meet people some at other places. So there's still not this, for me, I don't have this daily routine really. I mean, there's like this slot where I do emails, or on those days there's like maybe 2-3 Zoom meetings. I agree. Mm, I don't know. I don't know if I can really relate to this question. I mean, for instance, these eyes behind me, they're not in the studio floor where they've been photographed anymore. They're now at the subway station, and there's about hundreds of them. And when I look out of the window, I see the children going to school, and I know it's their eyes, and they are very proud that their eyes in public space. So, and I go down to the Geshe condo. We just had a bunch of exhibitions, even though there's the pandemic out there, and we work with kids, and we produce cushions with some woman of the neighborhood of political images on cushions and pillows. Well, I think that even if there's no pandemic, it's good when you go to art school that you take a different subway line or bus the other day, or maybe you change the side of the streets. I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply only to the pandemic. It applies to normal life, that it's good to change your perspective, especially when you're a creative worker. I mean, change your perspective, change your technique, change your computer, and change your thinking. It's a big challenge. I mean, we have the luxury. We're a design studio, a communication design studio, so we're not artists. So we have clients, and each client is different. And we don't reduce the clients to the project we're working with them. We try to interact on a human level. So when we ask how you're doing, it really has a meaning, and we share stories. And that's exactly what I tried to point out with Jeffrey in the beginning with his toddler. That's exactly what cultural production for me is about. So we're privileged because we have a lot of different clients, you know, small, bigger ones, institutions, activists, and this gives a lot of every day is different, more or less. But I agree, this times of less meetings and more online meetings is not good. There's some good things about it, some practical things about it, and there's even some of the meetings are even better on one side. Then they can be more concentrated and productive, but the bodies are missing, the real feeling, the real sense and smell, and the hugs and the small talks outside for the smokers, which are informal and important. These are all missing. I find it very tough for students. Haven't been teaching during the pandemic, but I gave some inputs and some lectures. And I hear this from my friends who are teaching. I think it's a hard time to grow your identity under the pandemic, and this will have an impact on our design, most likely also, even. We don't know. So maybe there's a good side of it, which we don't sense today. I don't know.
I actually think for young people, there is a good side of it, which is there's a lot less social pressure. Like, I mean, there's other pressures and anxiety around lots of things, but I think particularly for younger kids, when they've spending a couple years where you're not kind of being sort of soft bullied in a way to be a certain way, because you're around your peers all the time, and then there's a sort of push towards conformity, I think has let a lot of younger kids get weird, which I think is a really good thing. But overall, I think it's been really challenging. So let's jump in and see if anyone has any questions. So I don't know, Jeffrey, if you want to
There's-
facilitate that, or whether I don't know if I can sort of see when people have their hands up or not.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, if you don't mind using the raise hand feature so we can see. Sandy, you have a question?
Always. What happened to your kid?
No, I was just being bothered by a cat in his place, but he's here. It looks like we have a question, or is that still Sandy? Let's see.
Yeah, I will lower my hand.
Looks like Dawn has a hand up.
Okay, I gotta change my view here.
I'm going to change my view here.
Yeah, Don, go ahead if you have a question. Are you able to unmute yourself?
I can.
Okay, there it goes. Sorry. Hi there.
So,
I won't turn on my video. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Josh and I talked a little bit about, how images get recuperated into media, like you'll have a radical image, and then all of a sudden it's advertising a shoe or, some kind of a brand. And, initially I think your first reaction might be, how do we own these images? And then Josh countered saying that it's better that you don't own them, that they go out there and they're still carrying the original association and in fact, enhancing the association. So I just was curious if you had anything along those lines, this idea of image recuperation or assimilation, and whether it's a good thing or how to use that, I guess, in design.
well, I mean, this can happen on all different kind of levels. So it's a bit difficult to talk about this on an abstract level. So I mean, certain images we want to enter mainstream and to flood the world. Social images we believe in, which actually create solidarity. And there's images which are, I don't know the word recuperated, I think it means kind of like taken over, something like this.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets used often in a Marxist context in which like capitalism recuperates its opposition and uses it against. Yeah,
this is definitely happening, and no, I don't have a good answer to this. I think we should be more relaxed about it. I'm quite relaxed about this. I feel, I mean, what we've been seeing in the last decades in advertising, we've shifted from classical product and from image to more that capitalism is entering all spheres of our lives and social situations which are reproduced. When I started, it was very much about product and campaigns and producing some kind of an image around the product. And now a lot of advertising is about values. And that's what I actually find more challenging and threatening when terms like solidarity or social or friends or family I mean, family always has been in that advertising, of course, but I think you get my point. I find this much more threatening, and but I actually believe, when we are threatened by this, when we feel threatened by these things, then it actually also means that we don't trust the people, the recipient. And my experience is that the people, the recipients, are much smarter than we imagine as leftists. So I'm actually quite relaxed, even though I'm pissed and sometimes irritated. Don, I don't know if this answers your question in a fulfilling way.
I also think we could look at I used to get really angry when I would see advertising that had like absorbed May 68 imagery, like you had mentioned, Sandy. And then actually when I was part of when Occupy happened in 2011, and I was 2010, and then I joined the Occupy design group here in Zuccotti Park, and I was the only one who wasn't a trained designer, who hadn't gone to design school and hadn't, and I realized that the reason why May 68 was showing up in selling hamburgers was not because Burger King was interested in recuperating May 68. It's because the person who was tasked with designing that ad campaign was bored to death, and this was something they were actually interested in, and so they just brought it into the ad campaign to make their work more interesting. And so from that perspective, in a way, like it was that material was being used as a way to make life worth living. And so there's competing kind of valences on how to read recuperation at all times. I'm not trying to say that should be the dominant one, or that it's necessarily good that in a way, it's not good or bad. Everything that we make, everything we think, everything we do is commodified. That's life under capitalism. So if we don't like that, then it seems to me the only way to address that is to actually overthrow capitalism. And all the other stuff is almost an abstraction.
Well, yeah.
Not to say it's not worth engaging in questioning in, but ultimately it comes down to power on some level.
Well, as mentioned earlier, I think it's always important to look what context are we talking about. Now we're talking about advertising because it's the closest we can think of at this moment. But so, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it can be also the other way around. So activists also use branding and techniques from capitalism or capitalist culture and apply this to activist design. So it's also happening the other way around. Yeah, I'm not, I find it more interesting actually to think about how do we push certain images into mainstream? How do we get recuperated in a positive way? I don't know if this makes sense. This is what I would find interesting, but it's still a difficult question. It has been a question which has been always around. And the core of the question is that we fear that something real is being sold out, which is actually serving a cause, a big cause, and it's being sold out and then being empty and become a product. Yeah, I think there's too much fear in this. I don't have this fear, and yeah. But it's still an important question, which I think it's important that, no, I'm just blah, blah, blah.
Well, I mean, this dovetails with, there's a question from David here that says, what is the best way to spread a message artwork, which is exactly what you were just raising. And so maybe you could speak to an example where you've successfully pushed something out of a milieu and into a mainstream or sort of more status quo field. And like, what were the tools to make that happen? What was the leverage? How did you sort of get get under the image to pop it into that place?
I don't have a good example for one image because when
Maybe
I
a
think about-
campaign then.
well, when I think about politics and design, I have a hard time to think of anything else than Coty and Co. And I think, as I described in the beginning, we started with this sticker. And I think by now, most of Berliners understand that Cottbus Tor, this intersection, is much more than problems, that there's a community here. So it's not necessarily one image. It's a flood of different media and formats and events and strategies, which then create a different, a more sensitive and more complex image of one neighborhood, for example. There is no one best way to distribute one image. It really depends what is your aim, where are you talking, what, you know, so certain images should stay in one room. They're very private, they shouldn't move, you know, you take them to the bathroom. And some other images want to be shown to the whole world. It really, it's a huge question. I can't answer the question simply. What I find interesting is or what I always did find interesting, and I explained this with a few examples earlier, is to challenge the core audience. So when you design, let's say, for the Right to City movement, or for some leftist activists, for instance, anti-racist people, they have certain expectations on how images should look like and what the content is. But things are more complex. So it's maybe interesting to, on one side, as we just talked about the fist, Josh and I, to distribute images which actually raise more questions also in the within circles, and the converted already to the, not only preaching to the converted, convert the converted again. Let's put it this way. And yeah, so the question is very big.
Huge.
Huge, sorry.
No. I was agreeing.
Guys, I think that may be a good spot to end today, unless, does anyone have any last questions for either of our guests?
I would like to point out something maybe at the end, Jeff. You have a cat.
Yes, Mina, do you have a question or applause? Yeah, you can add. Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So my question real quick was, you mentioned at the beginning that you were influenced by kind of the student revolution, or like French graphic tradition. If you could elaborate a little more on that.
So in 68, I mean, first of all, 68 revolt in France, especially in Paris, also reached the art schools. And so there was a student, and not only a student, but also working class revolt going on in the country. And that's actually already the starting point, where artists and designers go out in the streets and confront themselves with a social conflict. So this was interesting to look at, actually. And Josh actually just mentioned some images out of this time that they're still circulating. And from this Atelier Populaire movement, that's how they were called, so popular studios, open studios, where they silk screened a lot of posters and then brought on to the manifestations and demonstrations. Out of this context, there was a group called Grapus, which is a wordplay between graphic design and Stalinistic bullshit, because they were called Stalinists by the right-wing people. So they made a wordplay called Grapus, which is, yeah, graphic design and Stalinists. And what was interesting about, or interested me about this group, was that On one side, they aesthetically were very strongly influenced by poster design from Poland. But they also worked with a lot of, you should definitely look Grapus up. It's very interesting. It's a collage style. It has a lot of influences also from, let's say, John Hartfield in the 20s, but also image inventions. Image inventions, when we talked earlier about social images, a lot of times we work with image inventions which challenge our brain to see the world with a different angle. And Grapus is very much about this. But I'll give you a story which I always liked, which I like to tell, because my professor actually was Alex Jordan. He was part of this group. And they were asked when they founded the collective a couple years later to do communication, city communication, advertising for a rundown neighborhood in Paris, I believe. I think it was in Paris, maybe it was a different city. So a poster campaign. So they were asked by the city council, could you do us a poster image campaign for this neighborhood? So they went to this neighborhood, and what they saw were a lot of posters, a lot of advertising posters. The whole place was full. And so they imagined what would happen if they would just add another, of course, great, much better image-wise, like interesting poster. But then I felt, well, what are the problems of this neighborhood actually? And what are we communicating here? Are we doing an image campaign, or are we doing some kind of change? Or are we helping to facilitate, to make things better in this poor neighborhood? So they took the budget of the poster commission and organized a street fair, a party, a block party with hundreds of people. And they invited social workers, politicians, teachers, children, schools, which all gathered, and they handed out a questionnaire about this neighborhood. And they filled out all these questionnaires, and they had meetings and discussions in this street fair in this weekend. And in the end, they decided, well, we're not going to design posters. We're going to design a book about this neighborhood where all this knowledge which we assembled in the street fair is then put together in one publication. And this publication, we're trying to force City Council that this publication is given to a present to every newborn child in this neighborhood and to his family. And this was very inspiring to me, because it was not, you're a designer, make a poster. No, it's really about where's the problem, and dig a bit deeper where the problem is. It's not about designing posters. It's really about solving problems or digging deeper into these problems. Posters are great, no doubt. Design is great, no doubt. What's really interesting is what's behind these posters and the problems. And the second part, which is interesting, that they work as a collective, and they split eventually. I mean, they were all men, and they had, so they started very small, and they've become very big. They designed the Louvre, the museum, for instance, big city communication for Aubervilliers and cultural centers, but they also worked for the Socialist Party, the Communist Union, and they also did, they always did a lot of things for free. And when I traveled to Paris in 1999, I think it was, or 2000, I visited a lot of collectors which emerged out of this group Grapus. And beside that, I was super welcomed, and people took time. And one of the greatest things was everybody had presents to give away, and everybody had examples of what they did for free for activists. And then at the same time for huge museums. And so French style, you sit together and you drink wine at noon and have some great cheese and bread, which you will never have in Germany or in the US. Well, probably now globalization, thanks, we have that. But so mainly, and there was one saying about Grapus, you order an underwear, but you will get a jacket. So, and I like the idea to, and that was kind of like this attitude to challenge the client and to work beyond the contract, maybe put it this way. And that was, beside all the political context and the content, I did find it always interesting to not only go beyond the paper, the edge of the paper, but also beyond the contract.
And
And there's on my website, you will find there's a catalog. I'm not sure if you can probably download the PDF with all the interviews, and maybe you can send it through translation. It's a shame we haven't translated these interviews with these French designers, because they're quite pathetic in a positive way. I don't know if you say that. So they're quite strong in their language, and very much to the point, some of them. Yeah.
I think that goes, you have this on manifesto, this 13-point kind of not program that you wrote, and one of those points is that you work for society, not for your clients. And I think that that's exactly what you're addressing, and maybe is a good sort of final statement. But you had said you wanted to say something also before we sign off.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we are talking about the angle of this. I mean, of course, I still want to know what graphic liberation can be, but maybe we have to make another appointment for this. I just wanted to point out that we are probably mixing up several things. We're talking about graphic design, we're talking about art, we're talking about communication design, but there's also information design. There's now user experience, user interface, there's social design, strategic design, and there's typography. And so there's a lot of things. And I think it's quite important to find out what one is interested in. I mean, it's totally fair to say, I'm an illustrator, I draw images, I create images, or I'm a graphic designer, I want to make posters. This is totally fine. Everybody has to find their own passion and be happy about this. But when we talk about the field of engaged visual communication and politics, then we have to kind of like be specific about these certain categories, because they can have different meanings. And I should have said this in the very beginning, I suppose. Yeah.
We can also muck up the sandbox by crossing the paths.
Right.
And maybe things can come out of that as well.
Right. Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Back to where we started. Okay,
Oh,
just
we
for
have
the interest of time, guys, we're gonna wrap it up. I want to thank you both, and thank Dash for Zoom bombing us today.
Oh, yeah.
I do want to point out, everyone that's still here, if you haven't already checked out the exhibit, please get over to the Gillespie Gallery. And again, thank you. I'm going to get off now. If you guys want to make any final remarks, we can stay on for a minute.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks everyone.